Throughout the years, there have been numerous unethical experiments and human rights violations committed by the CIA, including things like inhumane interrogation tactics and subjecting people to diseases against their will. In this video, I'll be talking about an incident that some have claimed is yet another CIA experiment carried out on unwilling participants. Let's get into the story of the mass poisoning of Pont-Saint-Esprit and some of the theories behind why it occurred. Starting on August 15th of 1951, hundreds of people in the small town of Pont-Saint-Esprit in France suddenly fell ill over the course of several days. They experienced symptoms in 4 stages. In the initial stage, people reported symptoms like depressive moods, agitation, and slight anguish. Within a few hours, they started to have digestive disturbances and nausea. They also experienced issues with their autonomic nervous system, like feeling flashes of cold and hot intermittently. As the illness progressed, they started to develop insomnia, which lasted for days in some people. In an extreme case, one man reported spending 21 days without sleep. Their digestive issues got worse and became extremely painful. In addition, they started to sweat a lot and had what was described as a disagreeable odor. Some residents experienced bizarre delusions and hallucinations, many involving fire, snakes, and monsters. A man named Gabriel Valadaire repeatedly shouted, "I'm dead, my head is made of copper and I have snakes in my stomach," at his roommates. A little girl thought she was being chased and attacked by tigers. A postman named Leon Armunier was suddenly overcome by nausea and hallucinations when delivering mail, causing him to fall off his bike. These hallucinations got so bad that he ended up being straitjacketed in the hospital. The symptoms of the illness were so severe that Leon has said that he'd prefer to die rather than go through that again. Some of these delusions ended up resulting in violence and serious injuries. One 11-year-old boy tried to strangle his mother. An elderly woman threw herself against the wall hard enough to break 3 ribs. A man shouted that he was an airplane before jumping from the 2nd story of a hospital. This caused him to break both of his legs, but he continued to try and run for several meters before staff could catch up with him. Describing the incident, a French newspaper reported, "It is neither Shakespeare nor Edgar Allan Poe. It is alas the sad reality all around Pont-Saint-Esprit and its environs, where terrifying scenes of hallucinations are taking place. They are scenes straight out of the Middle Ages, scenes of horror and pathos, full of sinister shadows. The mass sickness ended up affecting over 250 people. 50 were admitted to asylums, and 7 ultimately passed away due to the effects of the illness." It didn't take long for doctors at the time to come to a conclusion about what caused this mass illness. The article, "Ergot Poisoning at Pont-Saint-Esprit," states that the sickness was due to poisoning from people consuming bread from a local bakery that had been contaminated with ergot fungus. The bread was said to have come from Brienne's bakery, and there are inconsistent reports of what the bread was like, with some saying that it looked and smelled normal, and others claiming that it was gray and smelled like gasoline or bleach. To give you a little background on ergot poisoning, let me describe the usual symptoms. There's 2 categories, convulsive symptoms and gangrenous symptoms. The convulsive symptoms involve spasms and seizures, headaches, psychosis or mania, and abdominal pain and vomiting. The nervous system is generally affected prior to the gastrointestinal effects. The gangrenous symptoms, which are caused by vasoconstriction, include skin peeling, a loss of sensation, and edema. If left untreated, the affected tissues will die. These symptoms align pretty well with what the people of Pont-Saint-Esprit experienced. Ergot has actually been reported to be a cause of poisoning at quite a few points in history. The first case that I was able to find was that of the Grobal man, a bog body that dates back to 3rd century BC. While his death was most likely caused by his throat being slit for a ritual killing, analysis of his body also showed that prior to death he consumed a porridge that contained enough ergot to make him extremely delirious, and even possibly put him in a coma. It's also been suggested that ergot poisoning may have been to blame for the Salem witch trials. The mind-altering effects and convulsions may have been attributed to a person being a witch or possessed, when in reality they just ate grains that were contaminated. This has been contested by some scholars, but I thought it was an interesting theory to mention here. Ergot poisoning stopped being a serious issue in the 1800s in many countries, and by the 20th century it was very uncommon. The most recent reported case in France prior to what happened in Pont-Saint-Esprit was in the 1700s. However, there have been outbreaks of ergot poisoning in some countries as recently as 2001 in Ethiopia, so it's not entirely implausible that this happened in 1953. The dose of ergot that's necessary to cause poisoning can be tiny. It only takes a minuscule quantity of ergot to cause sickness in a relatively large group of people. The doctors studying the incident in Pont-Saint-Esprit believed that there was a large amount of poison in the bread, because people only had to eat a small amount to get very sick. Animals who were fed this bread began to convulse and die shortly afterwards, so the effects weren't restricted to humans. Prior to the mass illness at Pont-Saint-Esprit, several nearby villages also reported bread-related outbreaks of food poisoning. None of these were anywhere near as widespread or as serious. However, in 2009, the ergot poisoning explanation was challenged after an American journalist named Hank Albarelli claimed to possess a CIA document that shone new light on the incident. The document was labeled RE Pont-Saint-Esprit and F. Olsen files, SO Span France Operation File Inclusive Olsen, Intel files, and carried a bellin. Tell him to see to it that these are buried. The F. Olsen here refers to a man named Frank Olsen. I'm going to give a fairly detailed rundown of who he is, just to give some context on why this might be related to Pont-Saint-Esprit. Frank was a bacteriologist and was employed as a biological warfare scientist at the United States Army's Biological Warfare Laboratories. In 1943, he was working at Fort Detrick, and his experiments focused heavily on the use of aerosolized anthrax. It was around this time that Frank began working for the CIA. In 1952, he began working on Project Artichoke. This project utilized methods like hypnosis, LSD, and forced addiction to morphine in an attempt to answer the question, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature such as self-preservation? The core objective was to see what kind of mind control could be used to get a person to involuntarily attempt to assassinate someone. Project Artichoke was the precursor of Project MKUltra, which started in 1953. About a year after Frank began working on Project Artichoke, in February of 1953, serious allegations of biological warfare during the Korean War were made by several captured American prisoners of war. These claims involved the United States dropping germ bombs on civilians all across North Korea. These bombs supposedly contained things like shellfish, feathers, and insects that were all contaminated with diseases like anthrax and the bubonic plague. The US government denied that there were any truth to these claims and said that it was nothing more than propaganda. They also threatened to charge the prisoners of war who made these allegations with treason. When they were eventually released, the prisoners rescinded their accusations and claimed that they were forced to lie by their captors who tortured them. Around the summer of 1953, Frank's job required him to travel to several places in Europe, including Paris and Berlin. When he returned home, his family noticed that he was behaving very differently and was often in a bad mood. His coworker later said that Frank was a witness of interrogations in Europe where he claimed to have seen people be killed, and this upset him greatly. He became certain that the claims that the US was using biological weapons during the war were true. At some point, while he was in the UK, Frank was in contact with a psychiatrist with high-level security clearances named William Sargent. After the two met up, William allegedly reported that Frank was now a security risk. He also recommended that Frank's access to military facilities should be limited. A few months later, in November of 1953, a retreat was scheduled at Deep Creek Lake for 11 participants. Some were military personnel who worked at Fort Detrick, and others were involved with the CIA. Frank was one of these 11 people. During the retreat on the 19th of November, all but 2 of the participants would be sitting together and drinking. Unbeknownst to them, the liquor had been drugged with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the MKUltra project. No one seemed to notice any effects until about 20 minutes later, when Sidney revealed what he'd done. From that point on, some of the men spent their night laughing and loudly conversing with each other. However, others didn't enjoy the experience at all. One of the unwilling participants said that it was the most frightening experience he'd ever had. Frank was described as being psychotic, confused, and paranoid. As the night dragged on, he and several others were unable to fall asleep due to discomfort from the effects of the LSD. By the time the morning came around and everyone regrouped, most of them were agitated and just wanted to go home. Frank ended up returning to his house around dinner time, sullen and silent about what went on at the retreat. His wife tried to ask him about the trip, but he didn't say much for most of the evening. This went on until bedtime, when he said that he made a terrible mistake and that he felt humiliated because the others had laughed at him. He didn't elaborate on this or say anything else about what transpired during the retreat. Shortly afterwards, Frank arrived at his boss's office early in the morning. He seemed agitated and said that he wanted to either be fired or quit his job. After his boss assured him that his behavior at the retreat was beyond reproach, Frank decided not to terminate his employment. He continued to fulfill his duties for the rest of the day. However, within about a day or so, He returned, claiming that he felt too incompetent and that he wanted to quit. His boss thought Frank seemed disturbed and was in need of psychiatric attention, so he alerted Sidney Gottlieb's deputy, Robert Lashbrook. Sidney and Robert decided to send Frank to Dr. Harold Abramson, who was in fact not a psychiatrist but rather an allergist and immunologist who was actually involved in the CIA's work with LSD. Dr. Abramson was located in New York, so Frank and Robert traveled there together and stayed in a hotel room. This trip ultimately didn't prove very helpful for Frank. While he had occasional improvements, he would sink deeper into feelings of incompetence, depression, and paranoia. Eventually, things got bad enough that Frank was afraid to see his family because he worried that he would lose control and hurt his children. He agreed to be admitted to Chestnut Lodge, a sanitarium that was staffed by several psychiatrists with CIA clearance. His flight there was booked for the next day, and Frank called his wife for the first time in about a week. They had a pleasant conversation that helped ease her worries about him. Unfortunately, Frank never ended up catching that flight. At around 2 a.m. that morning, he ran straight through the closed blinds and window where he fell to his death from his 10th story room. This was 9 days after he was unknowingly dosed with LSD at the retreat. Frank Olson's official cause of death was ruled as a suicide. However, there is some evidence that suggests it may have actually been a homicide. A second autopsy of Frank's body in 1994 determined that he had a large hematoma on the left side of his head and a chest injury that were likely to have occurred before his fall. James Starrs, a professor of law and forensic science and one member of the team who performed the autopsy, said that this evidence was rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide. Speculations have been made that Frank was deliberately killed because he posed a security risk and that the story of him crashing through the window was a cover-up. However, no murder charges were laid. Frank's family received a settlement of $750,000 and an apology from President Gerald Ford and the CIA director at the time, William Colby. If you're interested in finding out more information on Frank Olson, I'd recommend checking out the Netflix documentary series Wormwood by Errol Morris, who you might remember from my Nub City video. So, back to Hank's document. The label on the document that Hank brought attention to also brings another person into this. It says that it's to be handed to Bellin, who is then in charge of burying it. Bellin here refers to a man named David Bellin. I won't dive too deeply into his life and career other than mentioning one point that I think is relevant here. David was the executive director of the Rockefeller Commission. This committee was set up to investigate illegal activities carried out by the CIA, and their report was published in 1975 publicizing the experiments conducted by those involved with MKUltra. There's a page in this document that mentions both Frank Olson and Pont-Saint-Esprit. In July of 1975, a New York Times article reported that unnamed staff within the Rockefeller Commission revealed that Sidney Gottlieb was to blame for covertly dosing Frank Olson with LSD. The article also states that Sidney ordered 152 files related to the LSD experiments to be destroyed in 1973. So, now that we know who Frank Olson and David Bellin are, let's get back to the claims made by Hank Albarelli. What exactly does Hank think that the connection between Pont-Saint-Esprit, David Bellin, and Frank Olson is? He claims that it's LSD and CIA involvement. Hank believes that the Pont-Saint-Esprit files mentioned in the document were supposed to be buried because they showed that the CIA was experimenting on the townspeople with LSD, just like what had been done to Frank. The files needed to be destroyed to cover their tracks. Hank agrees that the bread was likely the source of the poisoning. However, he believes that it wasn't ergot, but rather LSD, that made the townspeople so sick in 1951. He claims to have gotten a hold of another top-secret report that was issued in 1949 by the research director of the Edgewood Arsenal Human Experiments. Many of the experiments carried out at the Edgewood Arsenal facility were related to LSD and other mind-altering drugs. Hank alleges that the report said that the U.S. Army should do anything possible to start experimenting with LSD. Hank also used Freedom of Information legislation to get his hands on another CIA report, this time dated from 1954. The reporting agent outlines a conversation with a representative from the Sandoz Chemical Company located in Switzerland, a few hundred kilometers from Pont-Saint-Esprit. It was the only place that was manufacturing LSD at the time. According to Hank, the agent reported that the Sandoz representative, who had consumed several drinks at this point, blurted out, "The Pont-Saint-Esprit secret was that it was not the bread at all. For weeks, the French tied up our laboratories with analyses of bread. It was not the grain ergot." The agent then followed up by asking, if the material wasn't in the bread, then how did it get into the people? To which the representative replied that it was an experiment. Hank has also claimed that a U.S. Department of Justice website also implicates Sandoz in being involved in chemical warfare. He quotes the website as saying, "The The Sandoz chemical company went as far as promoting LSD as a potential secret chemical warfare weapon to the US government. Their main selling point in this was that a small amount in a main water supply or sprayed in the air could disorient and turn psychotic an entire company of soldiers, leaving them harmless and unable to fight. I couldn't find this website myself or anyone else referencing this, so I can't really speak to whether or not this is true. Hank has also claimed that 2 former researchers working for the CIA disclosed to him that the village of Pont-Saint-Esprit was initially subject to an air blitz of LSD. However, this ended up being ineffective, so the CIA decided to contaminate the local food supply so they'd be forced to ingest it, leading to the mass poisoning. Hank alleges that he was told by a former Special Operations Division scientist that the CIA were not entirely satisfied with the results at Pont-Saint-Esprit. He quotes the scientist as saying, "The overall results of the experiment in southern France were good, but there was also an adverse effect, or what would now be called a black swan reaction. That several people died was unexpected, completely unexpected. It wasn't supposed to turn out that way, so it was back to the drawing boards." Be mindful that Hank doesn't really show many of the documents that his claims are based on. The majority of his claims come from sources that can't be named, so most of the proof we have is just his word. And Hank's LSD theory has certainly been contested. Professor Stephen Kaplan, an expert on the history of French foods and an author of a book on this incident, thinks that the claims about LSD are nonsense. He said, "I have numerous objections to this paltry evidence against the CIA. First of all, it's clinically incoherent. LSD takes effects in just a few hours, whereas the inhabitants showed symptoms only after 36 hours or more. Furthermore, LSD does not cause the digestive ailments or the vegetative effects described by the townspeople. According to drugrehab.com, the effects of an LSD overdose, also known as a bad trip, include panic attacks, intense anxiety, terrifying thoughts, delusions, paranoia, rapid mood swings, psychotic episodes, and seizures. The physical effects can include increased heart rate and blood pressure, muscle twitches and shaking, dilated pupils, sweating, sleeplessness, and loss of appetite. Many of these symptoms were prevalent at the Pont-Saint-Esprit poisoning, but like Professor Kaplan says, there isn't really any evidence that LSD would cause the digestive issues that the townspeople experienced. Interestingly, a minute dose of LSD can cause death in animals, which does align with the incident in Pont-Saint-Esprit. Professor Kaplan has further condemned the idea that the CIA was behind the poisoning by saying, "It is absurd, this idea of transmitting a very toxic drug by putting it in bread." He said that the LSD would not have survived the high temperature of the oven when the bread is being baked, and thus would have been completely ineffective. Hank contests to this point by saying that the LSD could have been added after. Professor Kaplan has also disagreed with Hank's claim that the CIA originally tried to distribute the LSD via an air blitz, saying that the technology to do so wasn't even available at the time. Professor Kaplan's own theory on the source of the poisoning was that it may have been caused by the use of nitrogen trichloride, a substance that would artificially bleach flour. Nitrogen trichloride is also known as Agene, and the use of it as a bleaching agent for flour was banned in 1949 because it caused severe neurological disorders in humans as well as in dogs. While there's no definitive proof that the CIA was the real culprit of the poisoning in Pont-Saint-Esprit, I'd like to delve a little deeper into the connection between ergot and LSD. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, LSD, also called D-lysergic acid diethylamide, is one of the most powerful mind-altering chemicals. It is a clear or white odorless material made from lysergic acid, which is derived from ergot alkaloids which are naturally found in the ergot fungus that grows on rye and other grains. LSD was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann. He was an employee of the aforementioned Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland, where Hank claims another employee told him that Pont-Saint-Esprit wasn't caused by ergot. In 1938, Dr. Hofmann was working with lysergic acid, a chemical that comes from ergotamine, which is naturally occurring in the ergot fungus. A few years later, he was re-evaluating the compound and accidentally ingested some of the substance, resulting in the first LSD trip. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Sandoz began evaluating the use of the drug for therapeutic purposes. They ultimately put it on the market under the name deluted. When Sandoz laboratory was questioned about the possibility of LSD being the cause of the Pont-Saint-Esprit poisoning, they stated that they supported the conclusion that it was caused by ergot fungus. Due to the connection between ergot and LSD, some people have suggested that the Pont-Saint-Esprit poisoning was caused by LSD, but that it was accidental, rather than an intentional CIA experiment. This idea relies on the belief that the ergot accidentally synthesized into LSD in the bread. However, this is pretty much impossible. LSD can't just randomly synthesize from ergot since the ergot only produces ergot alkaloids, which need a strong base, then a strong acid to neutralize the base in order to create lysergic acid. Lysergic acid must then be reacted with diethylamine, where the carboxylic acid group of lysergic acid reacts with diethylamine, forming the corresponding amide. This finally results in the synthesis of lysergic acid diethylamine. So, basically, I don't think this theory is valid. There's yet another theory on what caused the Pont-Saint-Esprit poisoning, and it was actually supported by Dr. Hoffman. In his writings, he stated, "The mass poisoning in the southern French city of Pont-Saint-Esprit in the year 1951, which many writers have attributed to ergot-containing bread, actually had nothing to do with ergotism. It rather involved poisoning by an organic mercury compound that was utilized for disinfecting seed." Dr. Hoffman actually went to Pont-Saint-Esprit to collect bread samples shortly after the incident. When studying these samples, he determined that the cause of the poisoning wasn't ergot or any of its derivatives, like LSD, but rather a mercury guanidine derivative called panagen. Panagen was used to protect grain from insects. The symptoms of panagen poisoning include clumsiness, deafness, impaired vision, spasticity, agitation, stupor, and coma. While these symptoms don't entirely line up with what the residents of Pont-Saint-Esprit experienced, there is some overlap in terms of agitation and stupor in particular. Another piece of evidence that could support this theory is that there were apparently fluorescent red stains on the outer surface of some of the empty flour bags. When panagen was sold, it would contain a red colorant as a safety precaution. This was to avoid the coated seeds being used for anything other than planting. Scientific tests completed after the incident showed that while the colorant wouldn't penetrate the flour bags, the panagen itself could, allowing it to contaminate the flour in the bags. Tests using flour contaminated with panagen showed that if it were used to bake bread, it would only partially rise or not rise at all. Alternatively, it was later discovered that when seeds were coated in panagen, the resulting plant could actually accumulate mercury and potentially poison someone who consumed it or its products. It's been speculated that the plants that the flour came from contained panagen and that this is the source of the poison. In an article about Dr. Hoffman's findings, author Roland Fisher of The Ohio State University concurred that panagen was the most likely culprit, and he stated that the claims that LSD were involved were due to its rising popularity as a medical and recreational drug. Essentially, he believes that LSD was used as a scapegoat in this situation. So, that's the story of Pont-Saint-Esprit and all the interesting theories behind what caused the poisoning. Personally, I think that the initial conclusion that it was ergot poisoning lines up the best with what the townspeople experienced. But what do you guys think? Is there something that you think I missed? Let me know down below. I also just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's sticking around despite the way slower upload schedule. I'm hoping to be less busy by the end of summer and have more time to work on videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.